They're 55 years old, working 70-hour weeks. They have retirement account with 6 figures and health insurance kicking in at 65. They could walk away tomorrow, spend 20 quiet years reading, traveling, maybe actually using that cabin they bought in 2009. Instead, they're scheduling back-to-back client meetings through December, checking email at 11 p.m., skipping lunch to hit deadline. They're terrified of what happens if they stop. This isn't about money anymore. This is Gen X and retirement, and it's the most psychologically interesting refusal happening in America right now. Hi, this is Mark. What we're looking at today is a generation at a decision point that has nothing to do with economics, everything to do with who they think they are. The headline is simple: Gen X won't retire. The reality underneath is far more complicated, because retirement isn't a financial problem for this generation. It's an identity collapse dressed up as practical choice. Let me show you what I mean. The illusion is that Gen X is staying at work because they have to. Economic anxiety, insufficient savings, healthcare fears. All of that exists. Sure, but here's the crack: studies show that Gen X has actually accumulated more retirement savings by this age than boomers had. The math doesn't explain the behavior, which means something else is happening. Something psychologically. Let's start with the foundational piece. Gen X grew up in a moment nobody else experienced. Their parents, the boomers, broke everything. Institutions crumbled, job security evaporated before they even entered the workforce. Divorce became standard, both parents worked, which meant latchkey kids became the normal case, not the exception. No one was coming to save them. No one was going to hand them anything. They learned this at 8 years old, 11 years old, 14 years old. By the time they hit the workforce, self-reliance wasn't a value. It was a survival mechanism. And that created something very specific: a pathological need to control every variable they could touch. Because the uncontrolled variables, the ones they couldn't manage, had already destroyed the world around them. Work became the one place they could actually control outcomes. Work rewarded independence. Work valued self-sufficiency. Work said, if you make yourself indispensable, you're safe. And for 40 years that contract held. Retirement breaks that contract immediately. The first reality cut hits here. Retirement means surrendering control. It means moving from active income to passive income, which feels weaker. It means living off savings you have to monitor but can't really influence. It means trusting systems: the stock market, government benefits, healthcare, infrastructure. Systems that Gen X has spent 50 years learning not to trust. The psychological shift isn't stopping work. It's surrendering. Surrendering. And for a generation that learned in childhood that surrender equals extinction, that's not acceptable. Here's where most financial analysis stops and gets it completely wrong. The second reality cut goes deeper. It's not just about control, it's about identity. What do you do is the first question adults ask each other in America. For Gen X, the answer to that question isn't a job. It's proof of existence. It's the evidence that they matter. They didn't inherit careers from family connections, they built them from zero, in an economy actively trying to destroy job security. That made work feel like an achievement, in a way it didn't for previous generation. Work wasn't just what they did, it was who they were, and retirement means becoming nobody. The studies on this are unambiguous. Workers who strongly identify with their professional role experience depression and anxiety rates that spike 30 to 40%. For Gen X specifically, that correlation is even steeper, because their careers weren't just part of their identity. Their careers were a replacement for the family stability they never had. Work became the structure, the purpose, the proof, and the meaning all at once. Let's test what that actually looks like. Take a 58-year-old director at a consulting firm making $180,000 a year. Bonuses push it to $210,000. On paper, this person is successful, but strip away the title and the business card and the email signature with the company logo. What remains? That's the question that terrifies them, not the financial calculation, the existential one. The identity question is more powerful than any spreadsheet. Because here's the thing, many Gen Xers didn't develop hobbies or passions or social structures outside of work. They couldn't afford to. The economy demanded specialization. The corporate ladder required obsession. By the time they could theoretically slow down, they'd spent 4 decades building a life where work was the entire skeleton. Remove work and the skeleton collapses. Everything falls inward. Now add the financial layer back in. Because it matters, just not in the way people think. Gen X watched the 2008 financial crisis destroy their parents. They watched pensions evaporate in real time. They lived through multiple recessions, watched tech booms and busts, experienced a period where job loyalty completely disappeared. Many of them had to financially support aging parents while still raising their own kids. The sandwich generation, financially squeezed on both ends. That creates a specific psychological condition, enough money to retire, but a nervous system that remembers every crash, every layoff, every unexpected expense. The gap between having enough and feeling like you have enough is enormous. And it's not a rational gap. A Gen Xer can look at a retirement account with $800,000 in it and still feel poor, because their nervous system didn't learn from spreadsheets. It learned from instability. One more year of income doesn't actually make them safer. But psychologically, one more year of income feels like insurance against the chaos. Chaos. They've never truly stopped expecting. This is where the purpose vacuum becomes critical. Work organizes time. Work creates structure. Work gives you a reason to wake up and a metric for success. Gen X has spent 5 decades in forward motion college career building, raising kids, climbing ladders, moving to better positions, chasing status. They never paused long enough to ask what happens on the other side. What's the actual goal? What comes next? For many of them, nothing comes next, or rather they can see what comes next, which in their minds is the same thing. The research is clear on this point. People who don't develop identities outside of work suffer dramatically in retirement. Researchers call it identity disruption, the psychological state where the thread holding your entire sense of self together snaps. For Gen X, that thread isn't loosely woven, it's the only thread. So staying at work is easier than the alternative work. Is familiar work is safe. Work is known. Figuring out who you are without work requires actually doing that work. And that feels harder than the spreadsheet version of retirements. Let me introduce another layer that people rarely talk about. The fear of irrelevance. Tech moved fast over the last 20 years. Artificial intelligence is moving faster. Gen X watched their expertise slowly become outdated. They watched millennials and Gen Z move into leadership positions. They felt the subtle shift from being the expert in the room to being the person slightly out of step. There's something uniquely painful about this moment for this generation. If they leave now, they step into invisibility. But if they stay, they can fight for relevance a little longer. They can prove they still matter. They can demonstrate that their knowledge hasn't become obsolete. Retirement accepts irrelevance. It says your time has passed. You are no longer necessary. You are no longer moving the system forward. For a generation that has always had to be independent and indispensable and valuable simply to survive, that's not just uncomfortable, that's existentially threatening. The loss of structure deserves its own examination. For most of Gen X's adult life, work has been the structure. Work determined wake-up times. Work organized the daily schedule. Work structured the calendar around holidays and vacation days and quarterly reviews. Work gave the entire existence a skeleton. Without that structure, many people experience what psychologists call unstructured time anxiety. Everything becomes possible. And that possibility feels paralyzing rather than liberating. The human brain actually craves structure and routine when it disappears, when you're suddenly responsible for creating meaning and structure from nothing. Many people freeze. Gen X especially struggles with this because they've been in high-demand careers that required obsessive structure. They've become addicted to the rhythm of work, the email inbox that demands attention, the meetings that organize the day, the deadlines that create pressure and purpose. Giving that up isn't freedom. It feels like stepping off a cliff. Now let's look at what a specific person actually experiences in this scenario. Imagine a 56-year-old who spent 30 years in finance, married 1 kid in college, a house that's mostly paid off, retirement savings in the $750,000 range. On paper, this person can absolutely retire. The math supports it. But mentally, let's walk through what that person actually feels when they contemplate stepping away. Stepping away. First comes the identity loss. No more business card. No more email title. No more excuse for the 80-hour weeks. Who are you in a coffee shop if you're not describing your job to someone you just met? Second comes the financial anxiety. $750,000 sounds large until you start dividing it by 30 years. That's $25,000 a year in savings, plus Social Security, which doesn't kick in fully until 67. That person can do the math, they know it works. But their nervous system doesn't believe it because they've seen market crashes erase 30% of savings overnight. Third comes the purpose vacuum. What does Tuesday morning look like? What gets you out of bed? What creates the structure? What proves you still matter? These aren't small questions, and they're not financial questions. That's the critical piece. A financial advisor can solve the money problem in about 20 minutes, but they can't solve the identity problem. They can't solve the purpose problem. They can solve the relevance problems. Those are psychological and they're deep. This is why Gen X keeps working. Here's what's actually happening at the system level. Retirement was constructed for a different generation and a different economy. Boomers had pensions. Boomers had job security. Boomers had stable institutions and a contract that said work for us for 40 years, and we'll take care of you. That created a clean psychological transition. You worked, then you stopped, then you received benefits. The identity shift was real, but the financial structure was solid. Gen X inherited none of that. They built their own careers in an economy that was actively destabilizing. They have 401ks instead of pensions. They have to manage their own retirement accounts instead of receiving a check. They have to figure out healthcare until Medicare kicks in. They have to worry about market crashes because they own the risk directly. They have to think about whether savings will actually last because no institution is guaranteeing anything. Retirement culture itself was designed for a world that no longer exists. And so what you're seeing isn't Gen X being irresponsible or fearful. What you're seeing is an entire generation facing a psychological transition that the economy doesn't support, while living in an ideology that suggests retirement should feel like freedom but actually feels like amputation. Here's the core paradox. Gen X has more options than any generation before them. They could retire, many of them absolutely have the financial means, but they won't. And it's not because the math doesn't work. It's because retirement isn't an economic decision for them anymore. It's a psychological one. And for Gen X, retirement feels like a death that happens while you're still alive. It feels like surrendering control. It feels like admitting that your expertise is obsolete. It feels like losing the thing that made you necessary. Now, who actually wins in this scenario? It's not the Gen Xers who refuse to retire. Those people experience higher rates of burnout, health problems, relationship strain, and what researchers call persistent low-grade depression. The kind where you're technically fine, but you're slowly eroding from the inside. It's the people who figured out how to build an identity that extends beyond work. It's the people who developed passions, communities, and purposes that didn't depend on job titles. It's the people who had family support or financial timing that removed some of the scarcity anxiety. It's rare. Most Gen Xers don't have those advantages aligned. They don't have hobbies that turned into purpose. They don't have rich families that removed the financial pressure. They don't have communities outside of work. They don't have a partner who happily carried the identity load. They're stuck in the middle of a system that was designed for a different generation, facing a transition that no institution prepared them for. Let me zoom out for the final piece. The story of Gen X and retirement is a story about how identity gets built in unstable times. It's about what happens when an entire generation has to become indispensable just to survive. It's about how work becomes the replacement structure for everything. Family, community, meaning, purpose, proof of value. And it's about what happens when that structure is supposed to just stop and nothing was ever built to replace it. The forgotten generation is choosing not to be forgotten. They're staying, they're working, they're fighting for relevance in an economy that's moving past them. And they're doing it not because the math demands it, but because the psychology demands it. Because stepping away feels like disappearing, because the identity of Gen X was built on being indispensable, and retirement asks them to become dispensable. Maybe that's the real Gen X story. Not a generation that couldn't let go. A generation that was never taught to do anything else but hold on. If this breakdown lands with you, if it explains something you've been feeling or observing, that's the signal you should stay with this. The next part goes deeper into how this plays out in actual families and relationships and the structural solutions that actually work, not the generic retirement advice that doesn't apply to this generation. Subscribe for the next breakdown.